Hello and welcome to this video on the lessons from making tea that in a weird and unexpected way translate to home brewing. Hopefully thinking about it this way, the more familiar tea making, it'll be easier to understand some of the more complex ideas of brewing, albeit in a somewhat obscure method. The relationship between tea and brewing is in some ways a tortured analogue, but in others the corollaries are pretty clear. The major overlap between tea and brewing includes steeping or brewing, temperatures, time, saturation, extracting flavours, and the water used. These points share a lot of concerns, strengths, weaknesses, and practicalities with brewing, but especially with brewing beer. Perhaps this is why using tea instead of or alongside dry hopping, using tea has become popular over recent years. First, we have the simple difference between steeping and brewing. Like with brewing, the term is the overall process. In tea, this is steeping when you extract the flavour compounds. For example, when you have the tea bag in your cup and add water to it. In brewing, it will depend, but it can be, for a simple example, compared with the boiling and mashing process for making beer. These distinctions are important. In one way of thinking about it, it's the technically correct and specific terminology versus the more colloquial terminology. One is a procedure, while the other is a part of the procedure or process. Next we have temperature. You need to adjust temperature both with tea and home brewing. With tea, there's a need to use water as low as 80 degrees Celsius or about 170 freedom units, to about 100 degrees Celsius or about 210 freedom units. This is very much based on the tea leaves in use. The more delicate the tea leaves used, the lower the temperature needed. More robust tea leaves can, or generally need, higher temperatures. For example, white tea tends to be at the lower end of this, and black tea at the higher end. In a manner of speaking, grains used in all grain or partial grain mash for beer is the same. You need to use the right temperature. First of all, it's for the enzymes that break down the starch within the grains into shorter saccharides that yeast can ferment, but it's also to extract the right parts of the grain beyond these sugars. You don't want to extract proteins and undigestible fibers and so on without reason. You want some of these for flavour and other reasons, but you don't want all of them. If you did that, your mash or fermentation would be rather complex and full of things you don't need, leading to issues around taste, flavour, and longevity of its storage. At the same time, like tea, using too high a temperature will destroy your brew. That is, you want to shift from one temperature to another temperature correctly. In the case of brewing, or in the case of tea leaves, you want to maintain the right temperature. At least in the case of brewing though, you also need to shift temperature twice. You go to your initial temperature first, then you shift from that temperature to the second for the enzymes involved, and then a third temperature to deactivate said enzymes. Whereas with tea, you just have to make sure you get the right temperature for the kind of tea leaf we're talking about. The second consideration is time too. Tea steeped for too long will be very rich in tannins. This is one reason why it is a very dark colour, or at least that's the case if we're talking about a black tea. These tannins are also incredibly bitter. This is why if your tea is rich in tannin, and you steep the leaves for too long, the tannins leach out, causing a rather bitter and unpleasant flavour. For example, a Scottish breakfast is notorious for its rather harsh taste, part of which is down to the sheer amount of tannin in it. That's also why the Scots drink it. That and it's a replacement for coffee. In brewing, something similar happens. It's not just tannins, or at least not just tannins in grains. You can find them in a wide variety of things like fruit as well. For example, there's a wide range of phenols that are in grains, fruit, and more. These all contribute a number of flavours. Some are good, some are very not good. The challenge you face is that, although some of these are good, the longer you steep the grains, fruit, or whatever else, the more you're going to get, which can be a concern. And the next concern overlaps with this considerably. At a certain concentration, the grains or tea leaf content can only get extracted so far. Eventually, it gets to a point where the solution is just saturated. This is why you can add a finite amount of sugar or salt to water. If there was no saturation point, you could just keep adding salt, sugar, whatever else you want to a pot of water, and you would never have to worry about storage. It would basically be an item box, just in reality. The saturation issue is true under constant conditions, and the best example is if you take a pot of water and you simply place it on a stove but do not turn the stove on. You could keep adding salt and water forever until the pot overflowed, but it would reach a point where it does not dissolve in the water. However, once you begin to heat the water on that stove, you can increasingly dissolve more of the content in it, and this is true of both water used for tea and brewing. The problem is what happens as it cools, and to a certain extent how much you can extract at the right temperature. The capacity to hold the content of a solution goes down as it cools, generally speaking. In tea, this will be seen as the dark mass slowly accruing in the bottom of the cup. It's almost like a haze. It's the content, particularly phenols and tannins within the tea, that are falling out of suspension as it cools. In brewing, it's somewhat more obtuse, in that you can't as easily differentiate it, but if your extraction hasn't been as neat as you might hope, you can likely observe it as a haze within the fermentation. Importantly, the limit of saturation is the problem here. It is almost a hard cap on the amount of ingredients you can dissolve in your teacup, teapot, or fermenter. You cannot get anything more out of the tea leaves or out of the grains once you reach this point. This means that regardless of what you do, so long as you're able to observe the correct temperatures and so on, you'll have a point at which you can get no more of your flavorful ingredients into your water. This does bring us to the next overlapping consideration, which is the crux of what happens with the idea of temperature, time, and saturation, along with, to a certain extent, the technical versus common terminology, and that is the extraction itself. In both brewing and tea, common chemicals will be things like phenols. In brewing, it'll be phenol, sugars, and protein. These tend to be somewhat more distinct and separate, so for the most part we'll focus only on the phenols for the purposes of this video. In tea, you can extract most of the flavor compounds out. Now, not all of them, again, owing to the issue of saturation of the water, but also reaching an equilibrium of how much is within the tea leaves and how much of it is within the water. You'll get to a point where the pressure pulling on the phenols within the tea leaves is equal to the pressure trying to hold them in, and that will be the point of equilibrium. The big issue there is not so much the actual balancing act, but it is exposing all of the tea leaves and all of the surface of the tea leaves to this, so that you can suck out as much of the phenols or flavors as you can. It's one reason why you should be using tea bags with enough room within them for the tea leaves to move freely when you're steeping them. This allows for the entirety of the surface of the tea leaves or content of the tea bag to be saturated with water and therefore leach out all those delicious tea flavors. In brewing, it's a little more difficult. For the most part, in terms of brewing, what you're going to worry about is more breaking down the content of whatever it is you're trying to extract flavors from, whether that is quite literally crushing grapes, apples, and so on for a juice, or if it's in the case of barley, wheat, and so on for beer, milling it to a small enough size that you can then effectively extract those flavors out the same way without turning them into a sort of roux or a mixture of water and flour like you would have on a stovetop. That tends to make it much harder to get the flavors out. It's the extraction process that is the most difficult and most important thing to balance in terms of both tea and brewing, at least to the extent of this video. Because if you don't get it right, you won't get what you want out of it. You're either going to be extracting the wrong things, you'll be wasting material, or, in the case of the Americans, you might as well dump it into the ocean. both in the case of Budweiser and tea. Lastly, we have the water used. Both for tea and brewing, the water used can influence the flavours, and particularly the different waters used will alter the amount of certain flavours extracted. Now, this is applicable to tea in particular, given the nature of how important extracting the flavours is for the tea leaves, but also, to a certain extent, what flavours you get out of your grains, fruit, and so on. Further, in terms of brewing, while it's not going to affect the flavour profile the same, you're going to have to be concerned about its role to play with yeast, and the fact that yeast is necessary for fermentation. We won't go into a great deal of detail on its role to do with that, as we have elsewhere, but what is important here is that different types of water, largely thinking here of soft water and hard water, will affect just what you get out of your particular flavour sources or sugar sources in the case of brewing. Generally speaking, the harder the water, so long as it's metal hard and not things like calcium carbonate hard, the more flavours it will extract, but it can also lead to a significantly more off flavour versus using something like a more calcium carbonate rich product, which can have significant effects on the flavours again, versus a distilled or relatively neutral water. If you're first starting out a particular tea, using a distilled water is probably best, but it can also be hard to do. You can figure out if you're using distilled water or not by looking at the bottom of your kettle, assuming you're using an electric kettle, and seeing whether or not the element in the bottom is either developing a white powder-like substance or a darker substance. Generally speaking, the darker substance is an indicator of a harder water that's got something like calcium carbonate in it, as you're probably seeing carbon deposits. If it's a white powdery deposit, it's probably something like metals. This is the same issue either way for the hard water side of things. If there's nothing at all, it's probably fairly inert water that's otherwise neutral or close enough to distilled. And if it's soft water, you have other concerns again. Hopefully this video's made it a bit easier to grasp the similarities between brewing tea and brewing for things like beer, wine, and more. There is a surprising amount of overlap in many of the concepts that apply from one to the other. And to be clear, there are further complexities again, and we don't intend to go into the weeds of brewing tea and then comparing it with the backwaters of brewing beer or wine, just as long as you understand at least the superficial similarities. It's enough to be able to get people to go and understand that brewing is more than just throwing yeast and a bunch of sucrose into a tub and then trying to get your banjo out while the moonshine brews. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.